The ideas I listed weren't the only ones I had, but they were the more interesting ones. I might make a part 2 to this video. I should probably get onto that. Hello everyone. It's been many months since I released my video about changes I make to the level editor, and I'm back with some more ideas. However, this video will have a slightly different format than the original. The original video is organized into different segments that all had a central topic. However, this video will be a lot less organized and it will mostly involve me quickly listing off a lot of minor improvements instead of spending a lot of time talking about major ones. You can think of it as the original video's miscellaneous segment, except as its own video. Anyways, there's a lot for me to get to in this video, so let's begin. In Update 2.1, a feature known as duration lines was introduced into the editor. When enabled, it gives you a visual representation of a trigger's duration using a line that extends from the trigger and ends at the point where the trigger's effect is over. This feature is very useful for syncing certain effects in your levels, but it requires a lot of trial and error. If you're trying to fine-tune a duration line to a certain length, you pretty much have to keep adjusting the duration in the trigger's edit menu until its length looks close enough. This is why I think it would be cool if you were able to drag a trigger's duration lines with your cursor, allowing you to find the duration you're looking for with a lot less trial and error. Next, I think it would be nice if there was a way to hide the editor's GUI. Although there is an option to hide a portion of it during playtesting, it would be nice to have an option to hide all of it without having to be in playtest. This would make the screen a lot less cluttered up if you either wanted to take a screenshot of your level or simply look around it without having buttons all over your screen. Additionally, I think it would be nice to have a way of scaling the editor's GUI down, since, as mentioned before, it covers a pretty significant portion of your screen. GUI scaling would be nice for when you want to have an easier time seeing your level when you're working on it. I also think it would be nice to see an option to change a text object's outline color. I don't imagine this being too hard to implement, and I think people would find it useful for decorating their levels. While we're on the topic of colors, I might as well bring up the fact that when you're selecting a color, you don't really have an option to reset it to its default value. The only method you have of resetting it is taking a color channel that you haven't messed with yet, copying its value, and pasting that value into the color channel you want to reset. Having to do this is annoying, so I think it would be a better idea to simply implement a button that resets the color channel to its default. I really like the editor's layer feature. It's really helpful for dealing with a lot of overlapping objects that belong to different categories. However, there are 3 changes I'd make to it, which I'll list now. First, I think it would be nice if there was an option you could enable to make an object present in every layer. There isn't really much else to say about it. Second, I think it would be nice to have an option to change the transparency of the layers that you don't currently have selected. By default, Geometry Dash renders in objects that inhabit the layers that you aren't currently using at 25% of their normal opacity. This isn't really a problem until you have lots of objects stacked on top of each other, in which case they begin to merge together into one large opaque blob, from which point on it becomes impossible to distinguish whether any set object is in the currently selected layer or not. This is why I think it would be nice if you could either change the transparency of unselected layers or toggle their visibility off completely. Third, I would prefer if you could select your current layer using keyboard input instead of these arrows. That way, you don't have to hurt your hand by mashing up your mouse button. This next thing I'm about to say is going to sound extremely petty, but I don't care, because it's still something I think should be changed. So, I'm assuming you're familiar with these buttons. When pressed, they move your current selection 1/15 of a block in their specified direction, meaning that you would need to use it 15 times in order to move the selection a full block. So, what's my problem with this? Well, my problem is that 15 is an odd number, meaning that it can't be divided in half without the use of decimals. The reason this bothers me is because it means I can't move anything half a block in any direction using this tool alone. If I wanted to move a selection half a block upward, I would have to click this button 7 times, find this tool, and click it twice. I know that having to do this isn't exactly the end of the world, but I think we can agree that it isn't the best system of doing things. In my opinion, it would make much more sense if these buttons moved a selection either 1/10 or 1/12 of a block in their specified direction. Either one of these would have an advantage, so I'd be fine with either. Now there is one big problem with doing this, which would be the fact that there are probably many people who like the way these buttons work and wouldn't suddenly want it changed. That's why I think this will work much better as an option that can be toggled on and off rather than a permanent irreversible change. Hopefully I explained all of that decently well. This next change I'd make is a lot easier to explain. I think you should be able to use keyboard input for entering values into the alpha trigger. As far as I know, this is the only trigger that you can't use keyboard input for, and are instead forced to use sliders. And my one question is, why? I may as well take the opportunity to mention something similar, the offset parameter in the follow player Y trigger. This parameter, of course, controls how far the chosen group ID is offset from the player's Y position. However, this option is limited by the fact that you can only enter whole numbers into it. You can't use negative signs or decimal points. I'm not sure why it limits you like this, but I think it would be nice to see this changed. When you're using triggers that allow you to set a duration, there are many times when you want that duration to last forever. An example of this would be in a follow trigger when you want one object to follow another object indefinitely. That's why I would add a way to set a trigger's duration to infinity. I think the best way of doing this would be to make any duration set to -1 last forever. Although this could cause some weird things to happen in some triggers, it likely wouldn't be too big of a problem. Even if it did become a big problem, ROBTOP could simply prevent you from using infinite durations in that problematic context. Now I want to talk about some new features that were implemented in Update 2.1. Before 2.1 was released, I remember hearing somewhere that new selection tools were being implemented. Once the update was released, these new buttons showed up in the pause menu. I do like these buttons, these three in particular are especially useful. However, it kinda feels like these tools are improvised at the last second, leaving some of the features incomplete. First of all, these tools don't even have their own menu and were instead just crammed into some random area of the editor interface. It would make a lot more sense for these options to have their own menu, and I feel like the delete tools are a good example of what it could look like. The main question would be where this new menu would be placed in the editor. I think it will work best as a menu that opened when you pressed a button, and I think there are a few decent options for where you could place such a button. There are a few empty spaces along the top, or it could be added somewhere in the edit menu. Also, the selection filter tool is unnecessarily complicated. If I had selected an object and want to select all of the other instances of that same object in my level, I would have to go to the pause menu, enable the select filter option, exit the pause menu, go to the delete menu, enable the delete custom option, go to the pause menu again, click the select all button, and then afterwards I'd have to reset the selection filter option and the delete menu options to their defaults. I don't really see the point in complicating things to this extent, as a button that did all of that in a single click could have been placed right in the menu with the other buttons. So yeah, those are the two things I would change about 2.1 selection tools. This one is pretty easy to explain. When I'm placing down a dash orb in the editor, I'm never able to tell where it's pointing, so I think it would be nice if there was an option you could enable to show a dash orb's trajectory. A pretty small thing that might be cool if it was added is a custom jump pad object. It would be like the custom jump orbs, but instead as a jump pad. I'm not quite sure on the specifics of how it would work. Maybe it would toggle a group when your icon slid over it, similar to how a custom jump orb toggles a group when you use it. Or maybe it would do nothing and instead function solely as a decoration object. As I said, I'm not sure how it would work, but I feel like this is an item that would make sense if it was implemented. We already have custom jump orbs, so leaving out jump pads feels weird. This next thing is pretty unimportant, but I thought I'd mention it anyway. There's this weird glitch with the instant count trigger that occurs when you update the target group ID. The preview that displays the entered group ID doesn't update until you exit and re-enter the level. I'm not sure what causes it or whether it's easy or not to fix, but I just thought I'd mention it here. Another one of these extremely minor glitches is in the follow trigger. For some reason, when you enter values larger than 1, the slider groups go off the bar. Before I explain what this next suggestion is, I have a little anecdote to accompany it. So, on March 4th this year, I was getting ready to release my video about the seed controlled level. The final draft of the video was rendered, pretty much everything else was ready to go, and I was adding finishing touches to the level before I verified it. However, I accidentally clicked a button without noticing, and deleted a pretty significant portion of the level. I quickly realized that I had messed up and was about to press the undo button when I accidentally brought up the pause menu and clicked save and exit. Since there was no "Are you sure you want to exit" pop-up, that one misclick was all it took. The level was overwritten with the version I had messed up, and since I had exited the level, I could no longer undo my changes. Luckily, I had been saving backups of it along the way, and was able to get most of my progress back. Had I not gotten so lucky, who knows how long it would have taken to rebuild everything that was deleted. I feel like this demonstrates our need for a pop-up confirming you want to exit a level. However, it'd be better for this to be an option that could be toggled on and off since it would likely annoy some people. Despite this, it is still an option that many people would likely want added. Next, there are a few things relating to the pickup trigger that I think should be changed. First, it would be nice if pickup triggers let you type negative numbers in. At the moment, you can't use negative signs for some reason, so you're required to use this arrow instead. Second, I know this has been talked about before, but it would be nice if you could set an item ID to a specified amount rather than only being able to add or subtract from it. I think this would work better in a new trigger instead of the pickup trigger, because otherwise the pickup trigger's name wouldn't really make sense anymore. The last change for the pickup trigger I'm going to mention is something that I think might be a good idea, but I'm kind of on the fence about it. What if there was a way to add the value of one item ID to another? If this was added, I think it would work best as an option in the pickup trigger's interface that allowed you to choose between adding a predefined value or adding the value of an item ID. Hopefully that made sense. I'm not that great at explaining some of these things. Now let's talk about the shake trigger. It's a pretty cool trigger that I wouldn't change anything with, but I would add something to it. Using a shake trigger will shake the camera, which is useful by itself, but I think there are times where it would be cool if you were able to shake individual objects with this trigger. For example, you could use it in background effects, animations, or even for gameplay purposes. Imagine trying to play through a level with shaking blocks. This might be somewhat difficult to implement, but I think it would be worth it in the end and would be something cool to see in the future. This next change is another one I'm not 100% sure about, so I'll explain how I think it should work and then see what you guys think of it. So, what if there was a fill feature that allowed you to fill a selected region with the chosen object? I would imagine it working something like this. There would be a button somewhere that you would press to activate a fill mode. Then, you would be able to select a region by dragging your cursor to create a box, similar to how the selection tool works when swipe is enabled. Once you release your cursor, the selected region would be filled with whatever object was on your clipboard at the time. And yes, this would obviously only work if there was only one object on your clipboard. Next, there's another small glitch I want to mention here. This glitch happens with stop, shake, animate, touch, count, instant count, pickup, collision, and on-death triggers. If you select multiple instances of one of these triggers and click the Edit Object button, it defaults to this screen, where the only options you can change are whether the triggers are touch triggered or spawn triggered. This doesn't really make much sense. So long as the objects you have selected are the same type of trigger, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to edit all of their parameters simultaneously. In fact, there are many other triggers that allow you to do so, which are shown here. If you select multiple instances of any of these triggers, the game allows you to edit all of their parameters at once, so why should the previously mentioned triggers be any different? On a side note, there are also similar bugs present in collision blocks and counter objects. If you select multiple collision blocks, the Edit Object button doesn't work. The same thing happens with the Edit Special button when you've selected multiple counter objects. There's also another glitch that's somewhat similar to the one I just mentioned. When you have more than one object selected, the Edit Special button lights up as if you could click it. However, clicking it doesn't do anything. It doesn't matter if the objects you have selected would normally allow you to use the Edit Special menu. I'm not sure what the deal with this is or why it happens, but I figured I'd mention it. Now let's talk about how the editor layers objects across the Z-axis. When you go into an object's edit group menu, there are two options that control which layer the object is drawn on: the Z layer option and the Z order option. The Z layer option works perfectly fine. Objects set to a higher layer will appear in front of those with the lower layer. Although the Z layer option works as intended, the same can't be said for the Z order option. I've tried messing around with this option a few times, but I was never able to get it to work correctly, so I just assumed I was stupid and didn't know how the option worked. However, I recently looked into how the option is supposed to work and also tested out a few things in the editor, and now I can confirm that this option is completely broken. First, let's talk about how the Z order option is supposed to work. If you have two objects that occupy the same Z layer, but you still want one to be drawn in front of the other, that's when you'd use this option. Objects with a high Z order value are supposed to be drawn in front of those with lower values. Lots of the time, this feature does work and an object's Z order does control which layer it's drawn on. However, there are some objects that this feature doesn't work on, some examples I found being portals, speed arrows, user coins, text, and some, but not all, animated objects. Even when their Z order was higher than other objects on the same layer, they still appeared behind said objects. I'm not sure why these objects in particular behave so differently, but this should definitely be fixed. In a level's options panel, there's a setting known as 2-player mode that affects how dual portals work. When it isn't enabled, you can make both players jump by clicking anywhere on the screen. However, when 2-player mode is enabled, you can make one player jump at a time by clicking on its respective half of the screen. This was, without a doubt, one of the most revolutionary features to be introduced to the game, as it added a whole new control to a game that previously only had one. I do have a small change I'd make to it, but it's nothing drastic, and it's actually something I came up with as a result of this comment. The way 2-player mode is set up now, you have to choose between all dual portals putting you into 2-player mode, or no dual portals putting you into 2-player mode. So I think it would be nice if we were able to change this option for each individual dual portal. I think the best way of doing this would be to bring up a menu with 2 parameters whenever you click the dual portal's edit special button. From there, selecting either option would take priority over the level standard, but you'd also be able to leave both options unselected, which would make the portal adhere to the level standard. I think this is the best way of doing this because it allows you to change the option for each individual portal if you want to, while still leaving the old 2-player mode setting untouched. This idea was also added at the last minute due to a comment I got on the original video. The editor contains a custom objects tab that allows you to save groups of objects from your level so you can place them down later or even in a different level altogether. However, one fundamental limitation of this feature is that you can only save builds that contain 100 objects or less. Although this may seem like plenty, there are many times when you want to either save a more complex build or you want to transport a large portion of one level to another. I'm not going to make a statement saying this should be pretty simple to fix, since there very well may be reasons preventing ROBTOP from raising this limit. However, if it is possible to raise this limit, I think it would be really beneficial to level creators. For a long time, I've wanted a way to change an object's color without having to use color channels. This is what I originally thought this new button in 2.1 was going to be, but unfortunately it wasn't. I agree that color channels are really useful for many purposes. For example, they allow you to easily change the color of many objects at the same time without having to go and change each individual object's color. However, sometimes I just want to use the color once, and it would be nice if I didn't have to set up a new color channel for every new color I wanted to use. Objects such as portals, jump pads, or jump orbs emit 2 things if you use them: particles and a circular pulse effect. I like both of these effects. They look nice, but there are 2 small changes I'd make to them. First, I would add options to disable each effect. Maybe you could put these options in the edit special menu or something. Second, I would make the color of the particles and pulses emitted match the color and opacity of the object that emitted them. Currently, these effects take on the default color of the object that they were emitted from, leading to some weird combinations when their colors are changed. When it comes to opacity, particles somewhat match up with the opacity of their parent object, but pulses are the same opacity no matter what. I feel that a more stone-like ground would be fitting since we have multiple backgrounds that look like they're inside a cave. We have some grounds that resemble dirt or a more brick-like pattern, but none that resemble a rough layer of stone. I made this image as sort of a rough draft of what it could look like. You can't move speed arrows or touch triggers along the x-axis using move triggers. I can understand why the ability to move normal triggers along the x-axis would screw things up. The game would get confused about when the trigger was supposed to be activated. However, since touch triggers only activate when your player touches them, I don't see the purpose of preventing the player from moving them sideways. The same thing goes for speed arrows. Since they're only activated when the player touches them, they likely wouldn't cause problems if moved sideways. You can move pretty much every other object along the x-axis, so there isn't really a reason to exclude these two. Next, I think there should be a hotkey to pause the playtest instead of stopping it completely. That's literally all I have to say about this change. This next idea was actually in the original video script, but I ended up scrapping it at the last second. The reason I scrapped it was because I was unsure whether it was something that belonged in the game or not, and I also had trouble thinking of practical uses for it. However, I've thought about it since then, and this time I'm convinced that it would be something cool to see in the game. I think a good name for it would be the hide block. It would be an invisible block that would work by first allowing you to input a group ID via its edit special menu. Then, as its name implies, it would hide any objects behind it that belong to the group ID you input. When I say they hide any blocks behind them, I don't simply mean that any objects behind them appear invisible. That would be useless. Instead of making the whole object invisible, it only makes the object invisible in the sections that the hide block overlaps, allowing you to have a portion of an object be visible while another part of it is invisible. I mostly imagine this object being used in decoration when you want to make interesting shapes out of objects by covering parts of them with hide blocks. I also have another idea for a block that I think would be cool, a block that can't kill you from the side. We already have that, genius. Yeah, I know, but I think it would be cool to see a block that instead of breaking when you hit it from the side, it pushed you vertically to the nearest opening. Instead of this being an actual block, I think this will work better as one of those block modifier thingies that were added in 2.1. That way, you could give this property to any block you wanted. But what if you made an entire wall of them that spans the entire height of the level? There would be no opening for you to be pushed into, so what would happen then? There are multiple things that could be done in this situation. The player could simply die from crashing into it, the wall could push the player into a space above the level's boundaries, causing them to die, or the player could simply pass through the wall. Although this object would probably be somewhat difficult to code, I still think it's a cool idea that would be worth the effort. There are many times when you want to put a sprite from Geometry Dash into your level, but there isn't really a way to do it without building the sprite using objects from the editor. It may be cool to see a system in the future that allows you to insert some sprites from the game into your level without having to build them. I don't think every sprite should be available because that would simply be unnecessary. However, it would be nice to have a good selection of sprites to choose from. If this was added, I feel like it would go a long way. And finally, the last thing I want to discuss in this video is the build tab. I understand that the problems I'm about to mention are in no way easy to fix, but I still feel like they're worth acknowledging. First, there are many types of blocks that should exist but are absent from the editor. There are many variants of blocks that are missing, as well as many types of slopes that don't exist, especially with many of the new 2.1 blocks. I found evidence of a missing block variant as far back as Polargeist, meaning this has been a problem from the very beginning. As I said before, I understand it would be very difficult to fix every single continuity error. However, it would be nice to see fewer of these errors in future updates. Aside from missing block designs, there's another problem I want to discuss here. There are so many different types of blocks now that the blocks section has become a confusing mess. When I say types of blocks, I'm not referring to different block designs, but rather I'm referring to the block's behavior and how you're intended to build with it. In the original version of the game, there was pretty much one type of block, one that behaved as a solid block and had different variants for different types of edges. Then, some updates later, ROBTOP began implementing passable blocks that require you to put a solid block behind them. Most blocks at this point were still pretty simple to use. However, since then, many more types of blocks have been added, and these newer blocks aren't so simple to use. For example, there are these blocks that require you to make them using two different objects. There are stone-like blocks that were implemented in 2.1 that I still haven't figured out how to use, and let's be honest, you probably haven't either. There's also these grass-like blocks from 2.1, some more blocks that require you to arrange them in a certain pattern, and then there's all these weird blocks in the second blocks tab. These new block types alienated many players when they were first added, and they are certainly alienating to new players as well. There isn't really a way to undo what's already been implemented into the editor, but it would be smart of ROBTOP to not complicate things further in the future by adding more types of blocks, and instead stick to the types of blocks that he's already added. Those are pretty much all the ideas I had. I want to thank you for sitting through my rambling for over 20 minutes. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and hopefully you agreed with at least some of my ideas. It's unlikely that you agreed with all of them because even I'm on the fence about some of these. I tried to make this video's editing as similar as possible to the originals, so I'm hoping that was at least somewhat noticeable. Feel free to leave any ideas like these you might have in the comments, but unlike the first video, I probably won't be compiling these into a pinned comment. However, I would still be interested in seeing them. Anyways, I don't have anything left to say, so I'll see you guys next time.